HST109. This is our weekly wrap-up video for week 3. We are almost halfway through the class already. Just a few important reminders before I get on to a little bit more of a fun exercise, hopefully, about your discussion board posts. Overall, you guys are doing really well, and as long as you've been checking my comments and trying to take into account the feedback that I give you, you guys really should be doing pretty consistently well on those each week so far. The only problem is some of you are still not using any citations whatsoever. There are just posts that have no references to where you got that information or anything like that. So after this week, so from week 4 onward, if you don't have any citations or any references at all to any of the readings, you will get a 0. The reason for this is because it's a really important part of the assignment. And if you don't reference the readings, then A, you could be getting your information from anywhere, and we don't know, we have no way to reference it. And 2, even if you are getting your information for that post from the reading, it's plagiarism. And plagiarism is kind of a big deal. So if you have no references in your post after this week, I will note in your feedback if this is the case for you. You will get a 0 for that week regardless of the content. A second thing to keep in mind is some of you are still, for your parenthetical citations, not putting page numbers. A lot of you guys put phoner and then the year that the textbook edition is, which is 2013, and that's fine, but you cannot leave out the page numbers. Saying phoner 2013 doesn't do anything to tell myself or the classmates you're discussing with where the information is coming from that you're referencing. So the page number is the most important of the citation. I won't give you a 0 if you don't have the page number because at least you are saying where you got this from, but you will lose easy points, like 5 or 10 points, that you can just have no problem if you just remember to put the page number in. The last point about your discussion board posts is some of your responses have been pretty lacking in substance the past few weeks. I want to make it clear that the response post is not really just like, I agree and I find this point interesting as well. Like, that's not the response post. The response post should be engaging pretty thoroughly with what the original poster has said. The best way to get full credit on your response post is to bring in a new perspective that the original post doesn't address, or present some sort of counter-argument that if you have a different perspective from the original poster, presenting a counter-argument is a great thing to do. Or even if you agree with the original poster, that's totally fine, but then add a new point as well that strengthens the argument. So bring in new information that supports the original argument, but also builds and expands on it in a way that helps move the discussion forward. So make sure that you are putting the appropriate amount of effort into the response post as well, because again, largely as long as you meet the word count for the response post and are actually talking about the reading and putting some analysis of the post, you should have no problem getting full credit. And I don't want any of you guys to lose these points. So just keep those in mind for the next few weeks. And again, if you don't have citations, not very many of you, right? So most of you guys can disregard this, but you will get 0s after this week if you not have any sort of cite whatsoever. So this week we got a lot into the 7 Years' War and the lead up to the American Revolution. American Revolution is personally one of my most favorite topics to discuss because there's so many different things that you can do with it. There's so many different perspectives on the American Revolution. I argue often with graduate students who study European history, like my husband, who, when you're talking about a revolution, have a much higher standard of what constitutes a revolution than what actually took place in the American Revolution, where the casualties are fairly low, and just what changed after the American Revolution, which we will get into a lot more next week, can be interpreted to be on the tame side. So I really like talking about it. I've gone through and I've read all your original posts that were due yesterday. I've offered some responses, some comments where necessary, some questions for you guys to think about, just some sort of rebuttals or other things to consider. So if you see those, feel free to comment on them, respond to them for your response posts, all totally fine. Since a lot of your posts were very, I would say, sympathetic to the colonial perspective, to what was going on with the colonists, and you largely agreed with the actions that the British colonists took during that time period, I thought it would be fun, and I like to do this in my classes, to present an alternate perspective interpretation of the American Revolution, to challenge some of the things that we kind of take for granted because we are largely Americans in an American history class. So a lot of us come to the class with a lot of assumptions about the good parts of our history, the bad parts of our history. Of course, because the American Revolution is what led to the United States being an independent country, it's easy to say, oh yes, those colonists, they were treated so unfairly by Britain, and of course it makes sense that after they had tried to make things better, that they were able to win their independence, and the founding fathers are heroes. So, not that you can't make that argument, because certainly you can. I'm just presenting a different perspective here that I think might get you guys thinking about what you want to talk about in your response posts. So, here is my little alternate interpretation of the American Revolution. First, a lot of you brought up that many of the tensions between Great Britain and her colonies originated after the 7 Years' War, because Britain accumulated a lot of debt during the 7 Years' War, which makes sense. So, don't forget that prior to British arrival in North America, British troops, I should say, arrival in North America for the 7 Years' War, the British colonists in North America, in the colonies during that time, asked for British protection. They were worried about conflicts with Native Americans. They were worried very much about the French encroaching on their territory to the west. And once it becomes clear that this worldwide conflict is going to involve American, French, and Native American land rights, the first thing they do is ask Great Britain, hey, can you help us? Can you send some troops? Because there is no organized military in the colonies. They need Britain's protection, which they are, of course, entitled to because they are British citizens, as all of you guys pointed out well in your posts. So, the colonists are seeking protection from their government, which the government feels appropriate to give to them. The colonists benefited massively from the 7 Years' War. It essentially kicked France, and you're going to see it's an important part of removing France almost entirely from North America, which will, their presence in North America continues to decrease until the 1810s and 20s, when they're largely gone entirely. So, the colonists are participating in this effort that Britain incurred debts for, right? So, Britain has to eventually levy all these taxes, as you guys discussed, but talking about that, we can't forget that the colonists were very much a part of how that debt was accumulated. So colonists sought and received protection from their government. There's an interesting part of English law that states that freedom is enshrined in English law in its legislation. And the law specifies that subjects are free to pursue independence in the state of corruption. If the government becomes corrupted, then colonists are free to seek their independence or seek redress for their grievances. And as long as, and this is the point of the law, as long as that group is a majority, if the majority of the country believes that the government has become corrupt, then it is perfectly legal within English law to seek independence or other radical action like that. The patriots and the colonists are an incredibly small minority, even when we get to the actual revolution, and now we're just in the 1760s. Most people in the 1760s would never say that they had any interest, right, in separating from Britain. They were getting everything from Britain. They were getting protection, they were getting money. So keeping that in mind, this is a small minority of people that hold this view throughout the war. Most colonists largely don't care, and there are, of course, a large group also that want to remain loyal to Britain, although the number of loyalists does kind of trickle off at the end. But the patriots are also never a majority once we get into the conflict itself. So, we have a small minority who has a pretty radical idea about what to do, even though the government has protected them thus far. The Proclamation of 1763, which of course a lot of you guys wrote about how this was angering the colonists. They felt trapped. They wanted to expand westward. The Proclamation of 1763 was put in place by Britain primarily to cut down on defensive costs of the colonists expanding westward, right? Once we get onto the frontier, that's where we see increased conflict with Native Americans and French in North America. So the more westward you move, the more expensive it is to provide defenses to enforce that new territory. So Britain puts this proclamation line in place in 1763 to cut down on costs and to protect the colonists. Interestingly, part of also why Britain decides to make that decision is that Britain, unlike the later Americans, were actually pretty dedicated to honoring their treaty with Americans, and the Proclamation Line of 1763 involved a treaty previously made with Native American groups that ensured that the colonists would not further encroach upon their land. And the British Crown thinks they're doing the right thing by honoring this treaty with the Native Americans, which the Americans later do not have the same care for. So, you guys all talked about the legislation that was put in place in a variety of ways to help raise taxes, to help pay Britain's debt. Now, besides the argument I've already given you guys about the fact that the colonists had played a part in that debt, and thus it was not necessarily reasonable for them to ask the colonists to contribute to it, a lot of the anger that comes from this legislation, particularly the Navigation Act, has to do with the role that smuggling played in the colony's history by the time it was founded. The Navigation Acts weren't any new taxes or laws specifically. The Navigation Acts was actually just a proclamation essentially that Britain would now be enforcing laws that they had not previously. These laws were already on the book, nothing was new about them. It's just that previously Britain had sort of given the colonies the ability to continue smuggling by breaking these laws without any sort of repercussions. The British sort of just looked the other way. They were like, we know these laws aren't being enforced. It's not hurting the colonists. It's not hurting us, so we're just going to let it go for now. Now that the situation is hurting Great Britain, and therefore, by default, the colonies, they decide that it's in Britain's and the colonists' best interest to start these laws. But because smuggling had already taken such a large, smuggling was part of the colonial economy because they had gotten so used to not being held to those laws that were on the book. So they're used to doing business a certain way. Now that Britain's coming in and changing that, the colonists get upset. But no new laws have been added. They're just now enforcing the laws. So we have a small group of people, primarily merchants, right, who are upset that they are being held to the law, basically. They don't want to follow the law. They want to break the law. This essentially makes them criminals. Speaking of criminals, once we get the Stamp Act, what is normally told as the story of, the Sons of Liberty organizing these boycotts against the Stamp Act. Let's reframe that. Let's think about the Sons of Liberty as essentially a secret insurgent group, a small minority, that's employing enforcers to physically intimidate the colonists who are selling the stamps, right? That's how this boycott against the Stamp Act is largely done. This group that thinks that they don't want to follow the Stamp Act, the Sons of Liberty primarily, small group, deciding that they are going to physically intimidate those colonists in the colonies who are being told by the law to sell these stamps, punishing them instead of, anybody in Great Britain who's making these laws. Kind of makes them an intimidation group. And again, based on the fact that they don't follow the legalities of the law. We're of course all very familiar with the story of the Boston Tea Party to build on this argument. Boston Tea Party is like, oh my gosh, these patriots, they are doing such a cool thing. They're making such a statement to Britain. They're really sticking it to their unfair government. Well, all the Tea Party really did was take a radical group, small, again, radical group, destroying property, damaging government property, damaging private property. They were damaging the property of colonists themselves. And again, not doing any direct damage to those lawmakers in Britain, those members of Parliament who were actually responsible for creating these laws. They were creating chaos on domestic soil. They were using violence and destroying property, looting, all things that we frown upon, right, in today's context, and they were using them and employing them to their advantage. And we're largely okay with praising this particular narrative, but at the end of the day, the busing party and other things, like the enforcement of the Stamp Act, had largely to do with physical intimidation, with property damage, organized by a radical group. It was not necessarily the opinion of the majority, and they were hurting a lot of colonists that really just wanted to follow the law. So because smuggling went on for so long as it did, that's what really fuels a lot of this anger about the series of taxes, the Stamp Act, the Navigation Act, the Intolerable Acts. A lot of the confusion over about how those laws were to be enforced had to do with the lax attitude that Britain had taken towards smuggling. So you could certainly say that it was Britain's fault for allowing that to go on for so long. But again, it had been mutually beneficial up to a point. It helped both the colonists and the British government to not heavily enforce those particular laws until such a strong debt was incurred that that money was now needed in a way than it wasn't before. So, to mention the Intolerable Acts, we'll wrap up with that. The Intolerable Acts were, from the British perspective, essentially meant to put down a riot. By that point, they knew that this small radical group was upturning things in the colonists. They were upsetting daily life. They were not following British law, even though they were British citizens. And so they essentially the government has to step in, essentially just go back to saying, all right, we need law and order. We need to follow the law. We need to make sure that this rioting doesn't continue. And that's what the purpose of the Intolerable Acts is the government reasserting strength and reasserting the right that it has to protect its citizens from this small group that had been causing so much chaos. So that is your food for thought as you do your discussion board response post due Sunday night. I think that should get you guys thinking in a little bit of a different way about the American Revolution and how we normally talk about all those things that led up to an actual outbreak of war. Since we are moving on to the American Revolution itself very quickly, what I want you to keep in mind moving forward is the question, how radical really was the American Revolution? Revolution, in the definitive sense, is supposed to imply a very dramatic change, a turning point where things after the revolution are not really supposed to resemble things before the revolution. Think about that with the American Revolution. Think about what changes, what doesn't. In particular, think about slavery. Think about the way that the Founding Fathers are framing this government, framing all this rhetoric about freedom, independence, inalienable rights, all those things. And then think about the fact that we learned last week about how, even now in the 1760s and 70s, how deeply entrenched slavery is in the colonies. Also, don't forget about white women. They also get the short end of the stick with the revolution. But we'll talk about this a lot more next week. I just want you guys to keep that in mind moving forward and ask yourself really as you read, how much is really changing as a result of the American Revolution? We have a new government, but who was that government going to be for? It's a really important question to consider for next week. So that's all that I want to share with you guys for this wrap-up video. And I'm looking forward to reading your response posts. As always, you can email me with any questions. And that will wrap up our week 3.